Tonight, I want to focus on homelessness as the extreme end of the acute inequalities blighting our society. In the book Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Follett, the UK is reckoned to be the third most unequal country amongst democracies after the Arab Emirates and the USA. The average pay of CEOs in the top 350 companies has grown by 940% since 1978. Oxfam's 2016 report claims that globally just 62 individuals now hold the same wealth as the bottom half of humanity. It appears that not only have the global elite weathered the financial crisis, but that their fortunes have collectively improved. On the 29th of March, our Prime Minister, quarantined with his first symptoms, announced that he had discovered that there is such a thing as society. This was in response to over 20,000 retired NHS staff volunteering at risk of their lives, some of which have paid the price, to return to the front line. It was belatedly recognised that the huge community of the homeless, the most visible being those sleeping on our streets, posed a health risk to all during the COVID-19 pandemic. And on the 27th of March this year, councils were given 48 hours to find emergency accommodation. These same local authorities, which have had their budgets cut by an average of 30% since 2009, so that some cannot stretch even to the proper care for children and the elderly, let alone libraries and the arts. Nevertheless, homes of a sort were found for over 4,000 rough sleepers and families in shared accommodation. However, the Prime Minister's promise remains unfulfilled because the government wills the end without providing the means. Many local authorities, such as Southwark, have taken families out of shared accommodation only to put them into other life-threatening situations, such as the 60 flats on the Ledbury estate. These 4 tower blocks were condemned in 2017 as structurally unsafe. Work to strengthen them has been halted because of the corona crisis. These towers were built with the same system as Ronan Point, which collapsed in 1968. Also at severe risk are the 6,500 households in the social sector and between 13,500 in the private sector in high-rise residential blocks, all awaiting on the removal of the flammable ACM panels as ordered by government in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Charities dealing with people who have uncertain immigration status say they were worried that not enough support is being offered. People have no recourse to public funds status and therefore have not been rehoused. They are homeless. The question is being asked by many councils and charities for the homeless: what will happen once the bed and the door key is taken from those who have been given shelter? Are they just to be pushed back onto the streets? This is surely unthinkable. The present crisis has thrown into stark relief the increasing malfunctioning of the UK's housing provision, which has been steadily deteriorating since 1979, and the switch to neoliberal economic theory, under which your dwelling is no longer primarily your home, but your prime investment to give the security which the state has withdrawn. The concept that the commercial house providers could be persuaded or coerced through the increasingly emasculated planning system into building for social need rather than to satisfy the maximum return for their shareholders has always been an unconvincing fiction. During both world wars, the government assumed powers to requisition empty properties, to house those left homeless by bombing raids, or for accommodating troops and as hospitals for the war wounded. By the end of World War II, nearly 71,500 such properties were under government control. It is clear that in the present crisis, government interventions previously considered completely off the wall have suddenly become not just acceptable, but obviously necessary. So, why not the requisitioning of empty properties? The number of homes in London left empty in excess of 6 months was estimated in 2018 at 22,481. The borough with the largest number being Kensington and Chelsea, where only 83 of the 203 surviving households of the Grenfell Tower tragedy have been permanently rehoused. All political parties have been clamoring for increased house building, but the result, without prioritizing those most in need, is only to exacerbate inequality while submitting to the demands of the volume house builders. The number of new homes built for social rent has fallen by almost 4/5 in a decade, according to official figures. This comes as more than 1 million families are stuck on waiting lists for council housing in England. Figures released by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government show that nearly 6,500 homes were built in England for social rent in the years 2017 to 18, down almost 30,000 from almost 30,000 a decade ago. This graph here by James Meek is from his paper, Where Will We Live? Shall We Live Now? And it shows the dark area at the top is local authority council housing numbers per annum. Below that is housing associations dribbling along at more or less the same level. And underneath that is the private market. Now the dotted line, which you see rising exponentially, is house prices. And this demonstrates what happened when Thatcher turned off the tap for the public housing sector. However, it is questionable whether there is any absolute shortage of housing. Danny Dorling's conclusion in his book, All That Is Solid, The Great Housing Disaster, is that it is rather a problem of maldistribution and affordability. This was confirmed on Channel 4 News by an ex-civil servant, Ian Mulhern, November 2019, when he stated that house building had year-on-year outstripped the overall population growth. Just 3 years after the introduction of Right to Buy in 1980, the number of homes for social rent have halved. Now more than 60% of homes sold under this heavily subsidised scheme are in the hands of buy-to-let landlords. Some councils are buying back homes they once owned at 6 times the figure for which they were sold. Councils spend 22 million per annum in renting back properties they once owned. The absurdity of this situation, generated under the doctrine of shrink the state, is now thoroughly exposed. This is from a Guardian G2, which just gives an example of one block built in the LCC days and little captions which show the fate of the various dwellings which have been sold off, and some of them of course, belonging to buy-to-let landlords. Scotland, which scrubbed Right to Buy in 2016, has shown the way as they have in place a homelessness strategy launched in 2017. They have adopted the housing first approach, as was pioneered in Finland and also the New Zealand government, with strong follow-through on social and medical support for reintegration. This policy includes a commitment to tackling the causes of homelessness and focuses on those at highest risk, such as care leavers and survivors of domestic violence. In Scotland, they already have some of the strongest housing rights in the world, and they aim to go even further and to eradicate homelessness altogether. Now, I have tried in the last few days to understand the roots of the Milton Friedman Ayn Rand Chicago School of Economic Theory, which seems to have monopolized thinking on both sides of the Atlantic since the rise of Thatcher and Reagan. The belief that an individual pursuing narrow self-interest will also contribute to the advancement of the national economy, they attribute to the writings of Adam Smith, a fellow Scot. Although, as Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz quipped regarding one of Smith's better-known ideas, the reason that the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it is often not there. Adam Smith famously invented the concept of gross national product as the measure of economic health. It should be remembered that motorway pile-ups increase GDP, whereas childcare, except for commercially run nurseries, is zero-rated. But the neoliberals have grossly distorted Adam Smith, who saw that the most pressing dangers came not from the state acting alone, but from the state when captured by merchant elites. In The Wealth of Nations, what he called the mercantile system, by which he meant the network of monopolies that characterized the economic affairs of early modern Europe, he saw this as the threat. Under such arrangements, private companies lobbied governments for the right to operate exclusive trade routes or to be the only importers or exporters of goods, while closed guilds controlled the flow of products and employment within domestic markets. As a result, Smith argued, ordinary people were forced to accept inflated prices for shoddy goods, and their employment was at the mercy of cabals and bosses working against the interests of the public. The evils that Smith so cogently warned against, I believe, describe the very situation in which we find ourselves. Think of the secret talks being held between our Department of Health with US health insurance companies and pharmaceuticals, and the revolving door through which ministers and civil servants silently pass to use their contacts in slipping into well-paid jobs in the arms industry or big pharma. And when it comes to housing, there the market is dominated by roughly 6 major firms whose products vary little from one end of the UK to the other. Certainly after the 2008 meltdown, which served to further enrich the very individuals and institutions, or cabal of bosses, as Adam Smith would put it, which had caused that crisis at the expense of everybody else, one could rationally have expected some re-examination of the doctrine of the infallibility of the market. But zombie-like, this corpse continues to walk. Neoliberal economics is not so neo after all. This is not the first catastrophe that could be laid at its door. I lay COVID-19 at its door because it is widely believed that this virus is the consequence of factory farming and our abuse of nature and of our fellow animals on the planet. The Irish potato famine of 1748 to 51, which reduced the population of that country by a quarter, either by death through starvation or forced emigration, was the result not just of huge population increase, followed by the potato blight, but blind belief in the dogma of free trade. Slide. The famine was our Holocaust. During the mid-19th century, Ireland experienced the worst social and economic disaster a nation could suffer. The young Irish leader, John Mitchell, said, "God sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine." One of the many tragic ironies of the Great Hunger in Ireland was that as people died of starvation, thousands of tons of grain that could have saved them was instead shipped out of the country under the dogma of free trade. Peel's successor as Prime Minister, John Russell, was outraged by the lynch law of Irish landlords in ruthlessly pursuing evictions at a time when this was akin to a sentence of death. Russell's efforts to offer legislative protection for Irish cottiers were, however, stymied by a powerful cabal in his own cabinet of Lord Palmerston, the Marquis of Clanricarde, and Lord Lansdowne, all of whom owned huge estates in Ireland. This was a classic case of self-interest outweighing public interest, even though the lives of innocent people were in the scales. Another crime of genocide, rather more recent, I can remember it in my childhood, inflicted by government policy, is the 1943 Bengal famine, for which Churchill, with his obsession for the maintenance of the British Empire, bears a large measure of blame. A recent study says that the Bengal famine, that is estimated to have killed up to 3 million people, was not caused by drought. This famine was it could not be linked directly to soil moisture deficit and crop failure. Other factors were that the Indian National Congress had demanded that, as a condition for supporting the war effort, that a deal be agreed on independence for India and the conclusion of the war. This deal had been rejected, and then their leaders were imprisoned. It is claimed that wartime grain imports restrictions imposed by British government played a significant role in the famine, and indeed Churchill deliberately ordered the diversion of food from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers. Have we learned anything from these historical lessons of national callousness? When you consider the results of the hostile environment for the Windrush generation and the 726 deaths of rough sleepers in England and Wales during 2018, an increase of 22% over the previous year, it would seem that as a country, we are still capable of the othering and denigration which creates the environment in which such horrors become possible. Before 1979, there was cross-party consensus recognizing that shelter, health, and education are inextricably interconnected, and that the provision of a safety net to ensure these basic needs are met for the entire population is a governmental responsibility. All of this framework of progressive protection has been picked apart following the introduction of right to buy. Under Tony Blair, there was no let-up in the pressure for the privatization of the public estate. Lord Adonis, in his speech in 2015, showed his contempt for publicly owned housing by advising that the best opportunities for development in London were in the local authority housing estates, the largest holdings being in Labour-controlled authorities where slum clearance had occurred. So since 1979, 50% of public land holdings have been privatised under the doctrine of shrink the state. All public bodies, from the Forestry Commission to the Ministry of Defence and of course local government, have been obliged to prepare yearly audits of their land and properties, together with justifications for the retention of those holdings. Inflation in housing is basically rooted in land prices and scarcity, and therefore a more just access to essential shelter has to start here. Land with planning consent for housing can be worth 250 times more than farmland. This astronomical windfall profit should accrue to the community at large, as was done under the Attlee government with a land betterment tax abandoned by the incoming Conservatives in 1954. Naturally, as austerity has bitten, local authorities have been obliged to shed staff and activities. Therefore, it can appear that their property holdings are excessive to requirement. No such onus to justify need is placed on the private sector, where it is almost impossible to discover who owns what, as purchases are frequently made through shell companies registered in tax havens. Land banking is rampant. This corporate capture of public land is, in my view, a form of legalized larceny. Now, this next slide, which yes, has just come up, shows the reason the corporate world is so keen to invest in land. As it illustrates on this graph, the top line inflating exponentially is the value of land. Below that, we have dwellings, other buildings, and other forms of wealth. It's argued that the public that these forced land sales are justified to meet housing need, as is the decimation of the planning system. This slide shows that this is a false prospectus. It contrasts the capacity of disposed land with the non-implementation of consents between 2011 and 2015. There is no incentive to build, and certainly not social housing, as the soundest investment is simply in the land. Over the last 5 years, an average of nearly 21.5 per annum of social houses have been sold, 21,500 that is, have been sold, each carrying a public subsidy of £60,370. 4 out of 10 houses sold under right to buy, as I've already said, are now owned by buy-to-let landlords, with tenants paying more than twice their previous rent. 9.3 billion per annum is paid to private landlords in housing benefit. This shows a comparison of housing benefits as a proportion of GDP paid out by the various countries of Europe. The blue at the top is the UK, and the grey at the bottom, which is bumping along just above zero, is Germany. The consequence of this, that of all the countries of Europe, we shell out the highest proportion of our GDP on housing benefit. But this is still inadequate for those greedy landlords. And so we have 130,000 children in the UK living in temporary lodgings, and an exponential rise in homelessness and consequential deaths on our streets. Last year saw the centenary of the passing of the Addison Act, which was the first to require councils to provide housing for those in need. The First World War provided an impetus for this when the poor physical health of many urban recruits to the army was noted with alarm, and they were declared unfit for service in large numbers. The Haygate estate in Southwark is probably the best known and most notorious example of the effects of so-called regeneration. The Australian developers Lend-Lease, who took over this site, paid for the then Southwark boss, Peter John, to attend the Mipin Bonanza in Cannes, a great big yacht party for striking land deals, as a result of which 1,214 council homes were demolished. 189 of these were leaseholders, to be replaced by 2,500 units, new build, of which a mere 79 were for social rent. Now, when Blair made his victory speech after the election in 1997 outside Haygate, he implied that all the residents would be rehoused locally. The reality has been very different. What we have is the enforced diaspora of London's working class. This slide here shows the first slide shows where those in social housing were relocated across London. And the second slide shows what happened to the leaseholders who got an even worse deal. Sales for these new flats began in Singapore in 2014, before the building had even started. And Lend-Lease makes no secret of the fact that they are building for people who simply want to invest in housing. So they were offered abroad before ever anywhere offered in London. What has happened to the profession of architects? That we have become the tools for the implementation of these processes. My touchstone for the ethos that pertained within the profession when I first joined it in the early 60s, I will illustrate by a quote from Robert Matthew, to my mind, the preeminent public architect who headed the largest architects department in the world in the mid-40s to early 60s, the London County Council Architects Department, and managed to wrest control of public housing in London from the district valuer in 1949. At the 1965 UIA Congress, he said, "We as architects are dedicated not to self-interest, but to the urgent improvement of man's physical state. We have our own vision of the good society." This, I think, sums up the mood in the profession in those times, and it was the basis on which almost half the architectural profession was drawn to work in the public sector, which now employs something like 7% of architects. Now, the panorama of central London, if you view it from some vantage point, accurately reflects the formative invisible power of finance, as you see a great gathering of competing unrelated towers, each representing a commercial logo and contributing nothing but nothing to the public realm. The Regeneration slogan has become the cover for land grabs across London, notably in Lambeth, where the much admired Central Hill scheme near Dulwich by Rosemary Schoenstedt is under threat. And at Cressingham Gardens, at the edge of Brockwell Park, which of course is a highly desirable site, where residents have mounted a valiant resistance campaign. Alas, I fear the wrecking ball is moving in, despite all their efforts. At the root of this destruction of these well-designed schemes built over 50 years ago, only 50 years ago, they were designed to last a minimum of 40 years, after which the public loan has been discharged and the authorities left with a pure asset. There is no intention behind this to improve the housing of the nation, but for the privatization of our most fundamental resource, that of land, which is necessary for all human activity. Land value taxation, which has been implemented at a fairly low level, with much benefit in Seattle, and it has been used for the finance of public infrastructure. This is one route out of this absurdity. New Zealand has addressed their rampant inflation in housing with a new law restricting the rights of incomers to purchase under the slogan, "We think the market for New Zealand homes and farms should be set by New Zealand buyers, not overseas buyers." Now let us for a moment imagine what might be the outcome if those sales, instead of being invited with open arms, the world inviting the world's 1% most wealthy, who own as much of the earth's riches as the remaining 99%, we had a law like that operating in Germany, where any public land coming on the market first has to be offered to local buyers. This is what happened to create the satellite town of Vauban near Freiburg. Ex-military land was declared surplus to requirement, and 3 pre-existing housing cooperatives, all of whom had a commitment to sustainability, formed a consortium and put in a successful bid. Vauban is an innovative city development in the fields of energy, traffic, mobility, and building participation, social interaction, and distribution of public space. It provides new models such as group commissioning, integrating opportunities for startup businesses with housing, integrating them with housing, and a new sewage system with vacuum pipes, and dwellings achieving passive house standard, including a 4-story passive house built entirely of wood, the first in Germany. Vauban, where 2,000 housing units are planned to be realized at a density of 2.5 times that of a new suburb with a similar number of houses being built to the north of Winchester, still achieves a larger area of public open space than in the Winchester example. Within co-housing projects, the overall cost for buildings is much lower than if they had come off the peg, the portfolio of a volume developer. The transport goal is the reducing of cars in the entire district to everyone's benefit, so that for large parts of the residential area, the development plan prohibits parking spaces on private property. Cars are parked in a community car park, which you see here, located at the periphery of the residential area, and cars are only allowed to the residential area for pickup and delivery. The speed limit on the district's main highway, which is has trolley buses, a rapid transit link into Freiburg, is 20 miles an hour, and within the residential areas, cars should not drive faster than walking speed, which is about 1.25 miles per hour. Therefore, this is a very child-friendly environment. Here you see a lovely tree house. In Europe, co-housing is an effective third arm to housing provision, delivering about a third in quantity. The biggest and probably most successful example in Britain is the Coin Street housing development. But there is a very wide but suppressed demand for co-housing in Britain, but it's entirely repressed because of the difficulty in site acquisition. The Coin Street development only happened because of the intervention of Ken Livingstone. It was probably his proudest political achievement. In conclusion, I would like to mention an outstanding example of the selfless spirit of the community cohesion, which has emerged in these bleak times. And one of the residents in Dawson's Heights in Southwark is a woman called Shirley. Dawson's Heights I designed while I was working for the London Borough of Southwark in the mid to late 60s. Shirley was running in the pre-COVID crisis days after school art clubs and homework groups for children from the estate and coffee mornings for mums in what was originally a communal laundry at ground level. She also organised community get-togethers in the central space, which is entirely vehicle-free. But since the lockdown, together with a band of willing helpers, they are delivering shopping, ready-made meals and medicines to the most vulnerable. And she wrote to me recently that she had spent an hour on an access deck talking down a suicidal resident. I'm highlighting Shirley's love and generosity to the community of Dawson's Heights because I see in her a representative for, I'm sure, thousands in this country who reject the thesis that self-interest is a central motivation for human behaviour and who want to belong to something bigger, to reach out while there is still time to the universal humanity of which we are all part within our fragile, interconnected planet. You can't see all the little slogans here, but at the top, you've got Oliver Goldsmith, and there's a quote from his The Deserted Village. Ill fares the land, to every ill a prey, where wealth accumulates while men decay. Any questions?
Kate, that was fantastic. Yes, let's. If you have questions, please pitch them to me in the chat box. But the first one I can see is from James Payne, who I'm going to unmute. James, you've got the microphone.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you, Kate, for a wonderful lecture. I really admire the politics and the architecture of your generation and the work that was the lasting work I mean, I'm kind of sitting in a right to buy house, which I bought myself. So, you know, I feel slightly kind of slightly guilty in that way. But I suppose my question is, it's more about an architectural question. Did you have an intuition in the 1960s in terms of which of those social housing projects would be successful, like Dawson's Heights or many other of those kind of, say, Camden Council housing projects, and which would be a failure, say, like the Haygate estate?
Well, you say that the Haygate estate was a failure, but in fact, academic research has shown that the crime levels within both Haygate and Aylesbury were lower than the average across the borough. The my criticism of Haygate, which of course was built with an industrialized system, and at that time there was pressure coming from the then Conservative government, and the head of the housing and local government was Sir Keith Joseph, whose family owned Bovis, that all local authority housing should be built with big panel industrialized systems. So obviously he had a vested interest there. That did tend to drive an aesthetic which was very monotonous and repetitious, because that's how you got the benefits of the supposed economies of scale. However, you have to bear in mind that all these so-called failed estates have been suffering from 40 plus years of neglect due to the austerity measures imposed by Thatcher, so that she forbade local authorities from raising rents, and the rents were clawed back to the Treasury. 80% was retained centrally, about 20% was paid back to the local authority, who then could barely afford to administer the necessary management of the estate, let alone carry out the necessary renovations and repairs. So then, of course, the next step in that process was all manner of inducements were offered for the tenants to vote to switch the ownership of the estates to housing associations, which happened in the case of Dawson's Heights. The housing associations were much more generously treated by central government, so they could carry out the maintenance, which had obviously built up over the years. So when I went back for the first time after handover to visit Dawson's Heights, which was about 10 years ago now, or no, it must be a bit more. At that time, they had 3 caretakers on site, which when it had been in the hands of Southwark, certainly wouldn't have been the case. So, okay, I won't pretend that absolutely every local authority housing estate was utopian, but I would maintain that the worst examples, which happened, for instance, around Birmingham and around Glasgow, there was hardly an architect involved. They were package deals done in a great rush, and often it was being pushed through by the housing manager, or in some cases, which I think was the case in Birmingham, the city engineer. He was obviously very powerful because he was the one who put all the roads in. As to the design of Dawson's Heights, the objective I set myself to exclude the car from the center of the scheme. I think that is absolutely one of the keys to its popularity. I get spontaneous emails from residents, now they're in lockdown, thanking me for the generous space that is around them, so that they don't feel completely imprisoned. Does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, do you see a future for, I suppose, county council architects departments coming back? Perhaps is Is that a solution?
Well, just to correct you, county authorities never did housing. The counties were responsible for all other public buildings, but not housing.
Yeah.
The housing was supplied at district level in London, at borough level. So, in fact, this is a process which has already started. There are some boroughs, Islington, Camden, Hackney, I believe, and Croydon, which have set up arm's length companies, development companies. They're arm's length in order to evade right to buy, because what is the point of a public authority exerting its every sinew to provide decent housing, only after a few years to have it transferred into a private asset? The snag comes that in order to obtain the finance to carry out these developments, they have to densify on sites that they already own. So in order to square the circle or complete the process, local authorities should have restored to them compulsory purchase rights.
Next up, we have Catherine Flynn. Catherine, if I unmute you. I'm going to have to read it out, sorry, because there seems to be a problem there. Catherine's question is, if, as you say, architects have become the tools of a mass land-grabbing exercise that serves no positive social purpose, should an aspiring architect focus as much energy on political activism as professional training and development? And she says her son is about to start as an undergraduate in October, and he loves Dawson's Heights, by the way.
The short answer is yes. It would be wonderful to see more architects actively operating at local and central government level. I realise this is a very hard slog and a tall order, but to my knowledge, there's only ever been one architect elected as an MP, and he happened to be a Conservative, which was regrettable. However, if I come back to co-housing, the community land trust, I'm not sure where it stands at the moment, but that was a vehicle through which a community which had already set up a cooperative could seek funding in order to make a land purchase. This was successfully pursued in Stroud, where there was a site which was owned by Tesco's, I think it was, and they decided that the bottom had fallen out of ginormous supermarkets, and they were anxious to dispose of the site. So that would be one vehicle that a socially conscious architect could get into, because every housing cooperative really needs an active architect in there advising them. And as I said, on the continent, I worked in Scandinavia for a couple of years, and in Denmark and Sweden, housing co-ops go back a long way, at least a century, and their building societies are do what it says on the tin. They actually build, and they're savings banks where people on medium to low incomes can save and invest in owning, obviously, they don't own the freehold, it's leasehold. And leasehold law in this country needs a complete overhaul. But the housing court, to my mind, is a very ideal balance between community interest and individual interest. And it gets away from the rampant bureaucracy.
Next up, we've got Nick Walker. Sorry, I'm having difficulty unmuting. I'm going to have to read Nick's question. Are you there? Oh, Nick, sorry.
Hi. Greetings from Glasgow. Thank you for a wonderful lecture, Kate. My question is that there's a lot of talk about how COVID-19 is changing the society in which we live, is making people more aware of what it means to be part of a caring society. And presently we're being reminded about the importance of key workers by the very people in power who had seen fit to forget how important they were. Are you optimistic that this terrible illness and the change of life that it has brought about in the short term will engender a fairer, more caring society in the long term?
I desperately hope that will be the case. And I think you're absolutely right. There is an upsurge of realization of just how sick a society we have become. Not least in this factory farming issue. You know, you cannot live alongside fellow mammals who are drugged up to the nines, their immune system suppressed, injected with GMs to God knows what extent, and not suffer the consequences. We are part of an animal, an interrelated living organism. And then, of course, you've got the air quality improvement that everybody notices, that one of the benefits we're all enjoying is that people with breathing difficulties are having a much easier time of it.
What do you think we can do as architects to ensure that this change does last, and given that our sort of influence has been eroded over the last few decades?
That's certainly true, and when I contemplate the complete mess the RIBA is in, for instance, which I devoted a fair number of hours of my life, it is very difficult to remain optimistic. But I think you've got to, you know, the old Friends of the Earth saying, think globally, act locally. Get together with like-minded people in their community, in your community. Here in Winchester, we've got a multifaceted group calling itself Winchester for Action on Climate Change. And one of the committees that I'm on is the Better Buildings group, Better Building and Planning group. And we do our best writing to local newspaper, and unfortunately we're in a high Tory area here, so I'm letting my politics out of the bag, aren't I? Yes, my heart bleeds for the young, actually. I think I lived in a very fortunate age, but just get active.
Thank you.
Next up, Rebecca Galbraith.
Hi there, Kate. Thank you very much for a really inspiring talk. I was just wondering, as planning policy now uses house building to demonstrate economic growth under the banner of localism, is life cycle energy a better kind of driver for good design?
Oh yes, definitely. The big elephant in the room on the sustainability, contribution to sustainability of building is the existing stock. Even at the height of the house building during the 60s, early 70s, we were only replacing the existing stock by between 2 and 3% a year per annum. Now, of course, under the Blair government, Blair wasn't entirely without blame, but John Prescott's ladder of incremental improvement in the requirements for building regs for new design was excellent. Of course, it was scrubbed once the Conservatives got in. But also the inducements and incentives for people to grants, in fact, to improve the insulation of their dwellings, put in secondary glazing and install photovoltaics. And of course, when those grants were withdrawn, there was a huge crash out from the solar industry, PV industry. So now, of course, the price of PVs have gone down so much that in Germany, for instance, all new building has to either have a green roof or it has to have photovoltaics all over the roof. I mean, if you think of the amount of roof space there is available in every city, what a potential for energy, capturing solar energy. I've got PVs at the bottom of my garden.